You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, my name is Chris Coyne, and I am the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program and a Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Today, I am happy to be joined by my colleague, Nathan Goodman. Nathan is a Senior Fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program. And Nathan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's delightful to be here.
Yeah, we are here to discuss your contribution to the recently published volume, The Legacy of Robert Higgs. Your chapter title is The Military-Industrial Complex and the Militarization of Society. And so we have a lot of great and important stuff here to talk about. But before we get into the details of your chapter, I want to start big picture and ask you to say a little bit about how Bob Higgs's work served as the motivation for the ideas that you talk about in your chapter.
Yeah, so I first encountered the work of Bob Higgs when I was in undergrad, I think. So I was reading a variety of authors on the internet, various libertarian bloggers, and Higgs' name kept coming up. You know, keep in mind, the entire time that I've been politically engaged, the war on terror has been going on, right? And as a result, there have been debates among the entirety of society, but also among people who profess commitment to classical liberal values and to libertarian values and to values of individual liberty regarding how people should engage with this war on terror. And some in broadly classical liberal circles were supportive of various things the state was doing, and others were very critical of it. And many of the writers who were very critical of it, which were the writers I found most influential in some of my early development, were very influenced by Higgs, who was a very strong critic of the US government's war on terror policies. And so that was part of how I got introduced to him. So Higgs's work for me is always very closely enmeshed with a critique of the national security state and of US militarism. I recall that probably the only time I met him in person was at an International Students for Liberty conference, or ISFLC, where I saw him give a talk on crisis, Leviathan, and the national security state. So I don't cite that talk in the paper, but a lot of my understanding of how Higgs thinks about the military-industrial complex is probably shaped by having seen that talk. Shortly thereafter, I went to my first APPE conference when I was still in undergrad. So that's Association of Private Enterprise Education. And I bought a copy of Crisis and Leviathan at the Independent Institute table there and read it over the next few months. Was really struck by how Higgs engages with issues of ideology and its role in government growth. Within my first 2 years of grad school, I participated in a reading group that you led, where we read some of Higgs' books that were more on the edited volume side, dealing with his thoughts on issues like the state as a whole, as well as his work on the national security state. And so that really influenced my understanding of his work. So for me, the work of Bob Higgs is really important for understanding the growth of government, for understanding the role of ideology, and for understanding the role of militarism in our society and the growth of the national security state. So that's really what was inspiring me as I worked on this chapter, was a desire to dig into that and make it clear to readers what important insights Higgs offers into these topics that are so vital for understanding threats to freedom in our society.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So thank you for that context. I think it really helps to set up many of the kind of issues you talk about in your chapter. And I should note, while there's certainly a normative component to a lot of what you discuss in the meta sense, your chapter, I think, does a wonderful job. And one of the things I really appreciate about it, focusing on the positive analysis. So you're not making a judgment so much in your chapter per se, what ought to be, but rather you are largely focused on the dynamics of the national security state, the military-industrial complex, and diagnosing how it works, so that readers from a wide variety of ideological perspectives and persuasions will find a lot to wrestle with and to like about your chapter in terms of positive analysis. So let's turn to that. And let's talk a little bit about first what the military industrial complex is. That word gets, or that combination of words gets used a lot, but help us understand what it is, what the key features of it are, and some of the dynamics behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely think that positive analysis is an important part of the chapter. And it's an important part of Higgs' body of work on this because he started his career as an economic historian and he did detailed historical research on the growth of the US government and the development of the national security state and the military industrial complex. So he's done a lot of purely positive scientific research on this, historical research on this. And to understand what the military industrial complex is, we first should go back to where the phrase was coined, which was Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address as he was leaving the presidency. And he warned of the growing influence of the military industrial complex, by which he meant the sort of nexus of relationships between officials in the US military, private defense contractors that they're contracting with in order to develop and supply arms to that military, and also scientific researchers who are involved in the production of and research into various forms of military technology. And so the military industrial complex in this sense refers to this nexus of relationships. Crucially, also, an earlier draft of Eisenhower's address used the phrase military industrial congressional complex, which highlights the role that legislators play here. After all, legislators are the ones who are doing things like setting up the defense budget bills. And so that's going to influence who gets various kinds of military contracts, what the institutional context in which military contracts are made, and so on. And so the military industrial congressional complex highlights that it's not just about relationships between, say, generals and executives at private defense contractors, right, like Raytheon, Boeing, or Lockheed Martin, but also legislators who are playing a key role here, as well as their staff. So what are some of the dynamics of this? Well, one key dynamic that this brings out is rent seeking, right? So if you are in a position where you can expect to make profits by contracting with the United States military, you have an incentive to invest scarce resources in attempting to influence the allocation of the defense budget, as well as the size of the defense budget. And so, for instance, you might hire lobbyists to lobby legislators. You might invest resources in donating to congressional campaigns or hosting events on Capitol Hill for legislative staff. And this can be an investment of scarce resources that you expect to pay off in the form of more lucrative defense contracts, right? There's also a dynamic of rent extraction. Once these firms are receiving contracts, a legislator or their staff can say, wow, that's sure a nice, lucrative contract you've got there. Would be a shame if anything were to happen to it, at which point you can expect campaign donations, or in other words, rents, extracted from the defense contractors to the legislators. Another key dynamic is the revolving door, right? People don't spend their entire career in one place. If you're, say, a general or a high-ranking military official, well, you have specialized skills and knowledge that it's quite reasonable to expect will be useful to a defense contracting firm, right? Or to perhaps a lobbying firm, right? But, of course, the fact that you have those useful skills doesn't just mean you're going to be useful for identifying, well, what does the military need? What does the military want? How do we develop better technology to serve the military's needs? You also have social ties to others within your former organization of employment, right? So, for instance, if you're a former general, to others within the Pentagon. And therefore, you can use those social ties and you can use your reputation in order to attempt to get your new employer more lucrative contracts. This generates a set of relationships of cronyism. But another key thing that Higgs highlights that I think a lot of people neglect is the way that the military-industrial complex potentially co-ops people who would otherwise be engaged in the private sector or civil society. So say you're an engineer at Google. Well, You could primarily be using your career to develop search engines and email clients and other types of software that are used by consumers who are voluntarily choosing to use the product. But Google also, of course, contracts with various elements of the national security state to provide data related tools, potentially surveillance tools, right? So if a large portion of what would otherwise be peaceful civilian life that is part of the voluntary sector instead becomes entangled with the national security state, people who might otherwise be indifferent to or even antagonistic to coercive and militarized state action instead have a set of incentives that render them complicit with and perhaps even advocates of additional coercive state action. And so this takes elements of society that would otherwise be part of, we might say, peaceful, industrial, or civil society and moves them into being part of the militarized sphere of society. And so Higgs worries that this co-option renders the system of state control and militarized power more durable because individuals and interest groups that might otherwise be indifferent or antagonistic now have strong incentives to support existing arrangements of power.
Yeah, so thank you for that, and it's important because you have the military-industrial complex, so we have it defined, but really this last point you touched upon is I think central in that it is the effects of it, the wide-reaching effects, both in any given time period, but also through time, are oftentimes neglected, but really important because there's endogenous mechanisms which will make the structure, if you will, self-enforcing, self-extending over time. But also then you get these opportunity cost effects. Your Google example is a wonderful one. You pull resources into the military sector, and it's going to change the way they're used compared to the counterfactual, how they would have been used by private actors. And while some economists treat that as a kind of one-to-one transfer, a dollar here is the same as a dollar there, one of the things that Bob Higgs points out is that economics is a science of choice, and it's a science of choice in specific contexts, so that a dollar spent in the government is not going to be the same as a dollar spent in a private setting. And so that's an important point. The other point I like that you touched upon, which I want to now talk a little more about, is this idea of kind of belief systems and it's not just an incentive to reinforce the system in terms of narrow public choice incentives, even though that's important too. But there's also this ideological shift. And as you point out in your chapter, you transition to this idea of militarizing society after you discuss what the military industrial complex is, and ideology plays a role here. And so, if you will, talk a little bit about how the operation of the military industrial complex relates to the militarization of society and how that fits in with ideological beliefs.
Yeah, so ideological beliefs are really core to Higgs' analysis of the growth of government, right? This is what he considers the central contribution of his book, Crisis and Leviathan. A lot of people think of Crisis and Leviathan as primarily about the ratchet effect, about the fact that during crises, government tends to expand, and while there will be post-crisis retrenchment, it's never back to the pre-crisis growth path, but always instead to a higher growth path. But crucial to Bob Higgs' analysis in that book is the role that ideology plays in shaping when we'll see that crisis-driven government growth, as well as how the post-crisis environment shapes and alters the ideological presuppositions of people within the society. And so the beliefs that people have about the appropriate scale and scope of government, those shape what types of government policies and actions are going to seem feasible, are going to seem conceivable, right? There are some things that if a presidential candidate were to propose, they'd get laughed out of the room or they'd be seen as unserious. It would be seen as outside the Overton window. There are other things that they can propose, and those are seen as normal within the bounds of acceptable debate or even common sense. And what those are is going to vary depending on the ideological presuppositions of both elites and members of the general public. Now, what the military-industrial complex does by placing more people in particular kinds of relationships with the military is it alters not just, as you point out, the incentives of those people, but also their ideological presuppositions. We could imagine in one context a society where people see producing arms for the military as something that is a very bad thing to do, right? There's been rhetoric around merchants of death, for example, used for this. Or you could imagine another context in which you say, well, I'm involved in that industry. A bunch of my friends are involved in that industry. I know people who work in that industry. They're good people. Therefore, I don't see this as outside the normal bounds of society. I don't see this as crossing what Kenneth Boulding would call the taboo line, right? Instead, I see this as within the realm of normal activity that good, kind-hearted, decent people engage in, right? And similarly, you might imagine this for particular questions about the use of military technology, right? So under some circumstances, we might see, for instance, the use of drones to kill people as an unacceptable form of extrajudicial killing. But under another ideological context, we might see this as a valorized form of counterterrorism activity. Or we could have views somewhere in between that. And the role that the military-industrial complex plays in this is it directly implicates some people in the production of various forms of military technology in a way that alters their ideological presuppositions. Those people also then wind up shaping the ideology of the public through their participation in media, for example. So if we look to your book, Manufacturing Militarism, which you co-authored with Abby Hall, right? You have a discussion there that builds on the Pulitzer Prize winning journalism of David Barstow, who discusses how various former military officials, especially former generals, acted as talking heads on television in the lead up to the Iraq War. And what was undisclosed was that these talking heads were not just former generals. They sat on the boards of major defense contractors. And so what that means was they stood to make a lot of money if the Iraq War were to occur, because more funds and more contracts would go to the defense contractors whose boards they sat on in order to supply the weapons and other equipment that the military would need to prosecute the war in Iraq. And so generals in general have this prestige associated with military experience, with the idea that they've engaged in a sort of heroic military service. But if they also have a set of incentives that mean they're not just going to be public spirited, but instead have incentives to increase the profits of their employer or of the organization that they own significant stock in, that generates an incentive for them to act in ways that will use the authority they have that people are deferential to in order to shape the ideological beliefs of the general public. And so these are some of the mechanisms by which the entangled relationships between private and public sector organizations in the military-industrial complex can alter the ideology and beliefs of both elites and the general public in a manner that makes our society more prone to war, more accepting of a broad scale and scope of government power, and more accepting of a variety of civil liberties abuses and of crony capitalist relationships.
So we have this interplay now between these various actors that constitute the military-industrial complex at a point in time. Then we talk about the kind of extended effects of those things. Some of them are economic, some of them are ideological. And then kind of the next step in your argument that you lay out in your chapter is that, well, at least one illustration or manifestation of these dynamics is what you call the domestic security state. And you trace that to 9/11. You or at least you highlight that as kind of a focal point that led to the expansion of the domestic security state. So try to, if you will, say a few words about that in the context of what you just presented to us, the kind of logical steps that you and I have gone through here during our short discussion, to give the listener a sense of what you mean by the rise of the domestic security state.
Absolutely. So there are various elements of the domestic security state that preceded 9/11. For instance, the FBI had various security state features. The National Security Agency potentially has certain domestic surveillance features, and so on, right? However, the 9/11 attacks in 2001 created a situation in which many people felt that the 9/11 attacks were in part a result of insufficient interagency coordination. Different government agencies had information that was relevant to becoming aware that these terrorist attacks were impending. They did not share that information with others in other parts of the security state or domestic law enforcement. And as a result, the government was unable to stop the attacks. To deal with this problem, Congress reorganized large parts of federal law enforcement and security bureaucracies under the auspices of a new government agency, the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS. So DHS contains a bunch of other government bureaucracies. So, for instance, a lot of immigration enforcement authority was previously operated by what was called the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, which was part of the Department of Justice. Since DHS was created, the INS's authorities have been moved under DHS and split between two agencies within DHS. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which handles internal immigration enforcement. So they're the people who would, for instance, raid a workplace, send people to an immigration detention center, and deport them if they're already in the American interior. And then Customs and Border Protection, which handles external immigration enforcement, immigration and customs enforcement. So when you're entering the country at a port of entry, CBP are the ones who ask for your papers, search you, make sure you're not bringing in illicit material. The Border Patrol is also part of CBP, and they do various things to surveil, for instance, the U.S.-Mexico border, the U.S.-Canada border, and also American coastlines, and they have broad search and seizure powers there. And all of that is within the Department of Homeland Security, as are a bunch of other things, including, for instance, the Coast Guard, and I think FEMA is also under the auspices of DHS. So a lot of different government bureaucracies are all under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security. There are congressional committees dedicated to Homeland Security that are the ones in charge of setting the initial budget bill for DHS. So the House Homeland Security Committee, for instance. And so all of this means that the overarching ideology and policy rationale for a bunch of these different government bureaus is shaped by concerns that are framed in terms of national security. So Homeland Security, in particular, is the framing, that the people who are setting the budgets and setting the policy priorities tend to be people who are interested in issues from that perspective. People are answering to officials that are setting priorities around these counterterrorism rationales, these Homeland Security rationales. And so you could imagine instead framing immigration and border policy around any range of other rationales, right? Like, you could imagine customs searches being primarily about preventing importation of invasive species, and it could be a fish and wildlife issue, right? There's any number of rationales that could be made for this. TSA is another example, by the way, of something within the Department of Homeland Security. So the Transportation Security Administration, which searches you and scans your bags and subjects you to body scans every time you go to the airport, that's also within the Department of Homeland Security. So you have this domestic security state, especially under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security, Federal Protective Service, which protects courthouses. All these different bureaucracies are all within this one big bureaucracy. And this means that those bureaucrats, those government employees, they need to also purchase inputs that they can use for various things, right? Who's going to make the body scanner machines that you walk through in the airport? Who's going to produce the drones that CBP uses to surveil the border? Who's going to supply them with vehicles and weapons? Who's going to operate the immigration detention centers where the government is locking up immigrants, right? A lot of those are privately operated. So you have a bunch of private firms that have incentives to lobby the House Homeland Security Committee, that might have former DHS employees working for those companies or serving on their boards. So we have the revolving door dynamic again. There's opportunities for rent extraction by members of the House Homeland Security Committee against these firms as well. And of course, there's an ideological shift as people who might ordinarily be suspicious of DHS activities might find themselves contracting for it, right? So if we think about some of the companies that I see as I walk around Northern Virginia, right? I walk past the Accenture building. That's a major consulting firm similar to McKinsey, for instance, in terms of their operations. They contract pretty heavily with CBP and ICE. So people who maybe have cultivated skills that they could use for a wide range of activities, right? They've cultivated skills in putting together spreadsheets and presentations and analyzing data and making recommendations. They could offer those to corporations, to nonprofit organizations. But in practice, some of who they're offering those recommendations and analysis to are those in the domestic security state. This gives rise to what Higgs calls the security industrial congressional complex. I remember when I saw that talk at the ISFLC conference, when Higgs introduced this term in his talk, he said it's something like this: the security industrial congressional complex, sick. And so we see the security industrial congressional complex that is roughly analogous in terms of its structure and its dynamics to the military industrial complex. It has the same dynamics that we've talked about throughout our conversation: rent seeking, rent extraction, revolving door, militarizing society, shaping not just the incentives, but the ideology of key players. In your book, Manufacturing Militarism, you discuss the type of propaganda that the TSA gives to citizens as they're going through security checkpoints in order to encourage certain kinds of docile behavior and encourage citizens to believe that the TSA's operations are necessary for security of flights, right? That's a type of propaganda administered by the domestic security state that increases ideological support for the operations of the domestic security state and benefits private firms in the security industrial congressional complex that supply things like metal detectors and body scanning machines to the TSA. And so all the dynamics of the military industrial complex that shape US military policy and foreign policy also apply to domestic security and law enforcement policy, as illustrated by the activities of DHS and those they contract with.
So we're at the end of our conversation. In a line or two, and I realize it's a big question to ask for a short answer, but nonetheless, I'll try, or ask you to try. The volume is The Legacy of Robert Higgs. So given all this, can you sum up what you see as the continuing relevance of Robert Higgs? One of the goals of the book was not just to be backward looking, but also to discuss how his various insights are relevant today. And I think you've done a wonderful job, both in your chapter and here, talking a little bit about that, or perhaps a lot about it. There's even more in your chapter. But sum up for us what you view as kind of the key takeaway in terms of the legacy of Robert Higgs.
Yeah, so I think that what Higgs has done throughout his career is offer both deeply rigorous economic history and political economy that is attentive to the role of institutions, the role of ideology, the role of interest groups, the role of incentives, the role of knowledge, and how that has resulted in the construction of a powerful national state in the United States, including a powerful national security state, as well as the conditions that render that national security state, and in this case, that military industrial congressional complex and security industrial congressional complex, durable. And so any analyst who wants to understand the continuing operation of the military industrial congressional complex and the security industrial congressional complex should be grappling with the work and legacy of Robert Higgs. If you want to understand what the Border Patrol is doing, if you want to understand what the TSA is doing, if you want to understand what's happening at Raytheon or Boeing, if you want to understand how tech companies are becoming entangled with the operation of the security state, and if you want to understand the nexus of ideological beliefs that Americans have throughout multiple strata of society that shape the operation of these entanglements between state and private power, you should be reading Higgs and asking how both his historical research and his analytical frameworks can help you better understand the issues you're concerned about.
Nathan Goodman, thank you so much for spending time with us today to discuss your chapter. The title of the book is The Legacy of Robert Higgs, and it was recently published by the Mercatus Center. And listeners who are interested in reading more about what Nathan discussed today or about Bob Higgs in general are urged to check it out. Thank you so much, Nathan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hello, my name is Chris Coyne, and I am the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program and a Professor of Economics at George Mason University. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Ray March, who is a Assistant Professor of Economics at Angelo State University. Thanks for joining me today, Ray.
Thanks for having me.
We are here to talk about your contribution to the volume, The Legacy of Robert Higgs. And I'm excited to speak with you about this because what you've done in this chapter is to cover a portion of Bob Higgs's work, which is neglected, but quite important, as you point out. And the title of your chapter is What About the Healthcare State? Robert Higgs's Contribution to Health Economics. So let me begin by asking you to speak a little bit about the aspects of Bob's work that motivated your chapter for the volume, because when most people think about Bob's work, they think about his economic history, growth of government, and so on. But as you point out, his work on healthcare is really important. So tell us a little bit about the underlying motivation.
Yeah, my motivation to write about Higgs's contributions to health economics and write about his broader work in his analysis of the healthcare field really started when I was in graduate school. I was doing a PhD dissertation on pharmaceutical regulation. And I was, at the time, not really convinced the FDA covered a lot of aspects of how dynamic that economy was. So there was, if you will, a way of looking at regulation from the FDA and regulation from the private sector. And I had to go back and reread a lot of the literature on who did analysis of the FDA. And I came across a website called FDAreview.org, which now I'm fortunate to run. And the name R. Higgs kept coming up. And I had recognized Higgs from Crisis and Leviathan, which I read as an undergraduate. And I said, is that really the same guy? And yeah, it was. But that raised a question in my mind. Well, how come we always talk about Crisis and Leviathan? Why do we talk about the economic history? Why do we talk about the warfare state? Well, what about the healthcare state? The healthcare state has a lot of overlap, as Higgs points out, with the warfare state. And Higgs was very unique, especially writing back in the 1990s about what's the correct way to analyze the complexities of consumer choices within the healthcare field. How did the FDA go from safety and efficacy to regulating the size of holes in Swiss cheese? Or you need an explanation as to how far did it need to go to get to that point? And I mean, really, the inner workings of the FDA, most people who analyze the FDA recognize it's very sluggish and it's very expensive to get a drug approvable process, get a drug approved. But I mean, what are the incentives and the information problems that lead to that conclusion? And nowadays we understand that fairly well, but Higgs was one of the first to really delve into that and show how that worked. So my main motivation for contributing to this chapter was primarily that I thought this work is neglected and someone should really point that out. And I fortunately had the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Again, I'm grateful for you to contribute this chapter because I think you do a wonderful job making that exact point in a persuasive way. I want to turn next to and ask you to discuss what makes Bob's approach to the study of healthcare unique as compared to other economists. And I do want to read a line quote from your chapter where I think you highlight this nicely, and then I'm going to ask you to expand upon it. So this is you speaking in your chapter. Unlike the standard market failure-based arguments for government regulation in the healthcare industry, Higgs argues that the pervasive risk in healthcare choices requires a market to effectively allocate risky medical goods to consumers with varying risk tolerance levels. That's the end of the quote. So right there, you nicely highlight that there's something unique in his perspective of these healthcare issues that stand in contrast to the kind of typical market failure arguments. And so if you would spend a few minutes telling us about that unique approach, because I really think that underpins a lot of his research, but also I see this in your research as well.
Oh, absolutely. He's easily one of the clearest to highlight this sort of dichotomy or difference between standard health economic approaches and market process approaches, or if you will, Higgsian health economics, as I tend to call it. Health economics, and most health economists believe health economics is born with Ken Arrow's publication of his famous article, Uncertainty in the Welfare Economics of Medical Care, in 1964. And most of that book is about, if you will, trying to put medical practice into general equilibrium theory. But he has a smaller sort of quote at the end of that article, famous article, that says if we really want to have this market be efficient, you have to have, and this is a quote I've been rumbling in my head for 7 years now, right? Non-market social institutions. It's vague. That could be a lot of things. All it really specifies is not the market. Right? So that has to come in and solve that problem. So on the one hand, you set up health economics as a problem where the supply side doesn't really work as efficiently as we would like. And then later on, especially with the creation of behavioral economics and some of the other processes that come about coming in the 1970s and 80s, we start to believe that consumers making choices about their own health are done so under conditions of uncertainty, are done under conditions under poor health, things that'll manipulate, if you will, unfairly their ability to make decisions about something this complicated. And in that regard, you can't trust consumer choices. So the supply side has problems, the consumer side has problems. What does that point to? Regulation, regulation, regulation. Try to fix this problem. And Higgs, really going back into the early 90s, is the first time I've seen him write about this, says, I'm having none of that. Right? All decisions are made under uncertainty. There are health-based decisions which are very important that have longer-term implications, but they're all born out of uncertainty. And there's nothing that any amount of regulation or any amount of government spending to fix a perceived problem can fix. And we do that, right? Look how expensive healthcare is. We've definitely tried it. But there's no amount of regulation that gets rid of that uncertainty. And the crux of that kind of reasoning, or if you will, the sort of end point of that argument is market failure as a means to regulate these kinds of complex relationships is not justified. Instead, if you want to take the crux of his argument, which comes from rational choice theory, you can still be rational. You make a decision now based upon what you perceive your benefit is going to be in the future, not with, the godlike knowledge, if you will, of I made a decision, it turned out not to be a great decision. Now I have better information, therefore failure. That's not what rational choice is. That's not what any consumer has the ability to do when they make healthcare decisions. So starting from the idea there's always going to be uncertainty, there's always going to be complications, not just in the delivery of healthcare, but in this thing called medicine, right? Sort of in the background of all of this, that's always going to exist. So rather than start from a controlled paradigm and trying to fix these perceived problems through non-market social institutions, why not look at a market, right? Markets help disseminate information. Markets provide consumers with choices. Markets help allocate relative risk based on consumer preferences. And he says, in so many words, right, that's really the crux of where you want to start with health economics, not, here are 3 or 4 market failures, we have to fix them.
Yeah, and that's such a straightforward point in some sense, but also almost entirely overlooked or commonly overlooked. Let's put it to be perhaps charitable or perhaps too soft in the magnitude of the statement. And what's really fascinating about it is once you appreciate the point you just made, then it opens the door to comparative institutional analysis because you have uncertainty, as you put it so nicely, is a universal. That's a part of life. So then how are we going to deal with it? And then we have these competing paradigms. We have allowing private individuals through an array of arrangements and intermediaries to navigate that uncertainty, or we can turn to the state through this kind of top-down control and regulation, as you were just discussing. And that then, when we appreciate this point about comparative institutional analysis, that opens the door to the economic analysis of political institutions. And that's what I want to turn to now, because you have these 2 wonderful sections about in the middle of your chapter where you turn to the FDA. I want to take each of these pieces, if you will, or sections in turn. And so the first one is on the political economy of the FDA. And so can you tell our listeners a little bit about how Bob leveraged the insights of political economy to understand the operations of the FDA and its evolution through time? And then we'll come back after that and talk a little bit about the role of crisis, which you also talk about in your chapter.
Sure. Let me give a little bit of context into what Bob is trying to delve into. So when Bob is writing about most of his work on the FDA comes about in the late 1990s. That's a period, if you will, in the early 1990s, where the FDA is at that point resulting in 12, 15 years to get a drug approved, billions of dollars to get a single drug approved. It has a lot of restrictive regulations on what we can say or market a drug as its ability to do and things like that. Bob is taking a step back and saying, we know a lot at this point that the FDA is sluggish and that it's expensive, and we have other developed nation systems of drug approval to look at that and make comparison points. So that's sort of that political regulatory aspect you were talking about. But what Bob is particularly interested in, and he really is just one of the first to do this, why is it sluggish? Why is it expensive? That's an incentive problem. And it's an incentive problem faced by an organization he characterizes it as. And this was a huge point in my development as a health economist. What the FDA does, regardless of what kind of regulatory power we give it, is decide what doesn't go on the market. That's what it does. And that's true of pharmaceuticals, that's true of medical devices, which he spends a lot of his time trying to analyze the market for medical devices. And once you set up an organization, a political organization especially, and give it that kind of a power, you immediately run into two problems. One of them is the direct political economy problem, right? What are the political incentives when you give an organization that ability? And the second one, more of an Austrian point, but it's also a political economy approach, is okay, how do you have the information to decide what drug gets on the market or which medical device is effective enough? Or at what point is the risk not as good as the benefit, right? Because most medical goods have risk and benefit. They're not clearly safe. They're not clearly dangerous, right? There's a balancing act. So give one organization that authority, what choice does it make? So boiling down to the incentives of the FDA, we kind of reach, I don't want to say a negative, but a concerning conclusion, right? The FDA as a bureaucracy and as a monopoly of this authority has a lot of incentive to increase its own regulatory scope and power. That's why, as I mentioned earlier, it goes from pharmaceutical regulation to medical device regulation to tobacco to vaping to the size of holes in Swiss cheese. Until recently, it was regulating how many cherries had to be in frozen cherry pie. It had a press conference, if you will. That was a major deregulatory movement. They celebrated this. But that's an organization that steadily increases its power. And you have to wonder about the incentives. So if I am a drug regulator, right, or a drug approver, as Higgs sets up his framework, I can approve a drug, I can approve a medical good. If it turns out the medical good had comparatively high risk, I get the brunt. If it turns out the good was fine and I approve it, markets already do that, right? I didn't really add anything to the process. The problem is in the ambiguity. What if it's relatively effective, but it's also relatively harmful? Higgs answers that question earlier by saying, right, that's a consumer preference argument, right? That's the consumer's choice. Possibly give them more information so they can make the best one, but that's how you would solve that problem. The FDA can't solve that problem that way. The FDA has to decide yes or no, or do what it typically does and say more tests, rerun the clinical trials. Well, that's more money and more time. Or it just flat out says no, which is always its conservative bias, right? Why would I want to let a drug out there that has some element of risk, which would end up creating a problem, which could create political backlash for me? And just one more thing on this, where he really, I think, makes a huge contribution, both in terms of the political analysis of the FDA, but also just in terms of health economics. He's really, one of a handful of scholars to take that sort of incentive structure and then apply it to medical devices. Probably 95% of the analysis of the FDA is pharmaceuticals. And I understand why. It's 10% of a gigantic healthcare market. So yeah, it deserves some attention. Medical devices are most of the diagnostic devices, right? That's where we figure out, is there a medical problem? Not a lot of attention goes there. And Higgs spends a considerable effort going through how did medical devices become so regulated, right? What were the progressive political processes, grantings of power that allowed for that? And then once the FDA got that authority, what did it do with it? The same thing it does with pharmaceuticals and everything else, right? It increases its regulatory scope. It makes it more stringent to get these things on the market. And then if there are early signs of a problem, it yanks it. And very few economists did that analysis. And we owe a great debt to Higgs for doing that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you raised it. You raised it in your chapter, but I'm glad you raised it here too about the medical device point, because that is quite important for both analytically, but of course, more fundamentally for human well-being, the availability of devices for people that are facing a whole range of health challenges. So then let's continue with this discussion of the FDA. We talked a little bit there about the political economy aspect. So then you have this section in your chapter called Crisis and the Growth of the FDA. And I'd like to read two lines that you have in here, which I think do two things. It nicely captures the connection now between Bob's work on healthcare and his work on crisis and the growth of government, but also brings in this idea of public fear. And so let me read this, and I'm going to ask you just to comment on it and say some words. This is you writing. Higgs's contribution to this scholarship was to analyze and explain why the agency expanded over time. Following a similar framework developed in his research analyzing the growth of government during crisis, Higgs attributes much of the FDA's expansion to public fear and state-led opportunism. And so say a few words building upon that and telling our listeners a little bit more about the growth of the FDA and how it ties into the broader analysis.
Absolutely. So, and I think most people familiar with Robert Higgs, as you pointed out, know that the growth of government during a crisis is arguably his best contribution, right? I would make a case that healthcare is a second close, but that's probably his most well-known contribution. And Higgs, again, very uniquely asked the question, why did the FDA get so big? Why did it get clunky? Why did it get bureaucratic? That's somewhat well answered, partially by him. But how did you go from safety and efficacy to now it's an organization that a fair amount of economists think has some regulatory authority over about 20% of all consumer goods? And that's dated by, that was written in 2008, right? I think it's probably closer to 25 because that doesn't include tobacco, that doesn't include vaping, that doesn't include laboratory developed tests, that doesn't include a host of other things that it's gained power over really over the last decade. So how does it get that big? Well, Higgs already has a framework for that, right? He develops it in Crisis and Leviathan. And then about 4 years later, he says, yeah, this applies to the FDA. Medical decisions are terrifying. A lot of them really are. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know a whole lot about some of the decisions we make. Even doctors don't really know a lot about the things they're specialized in, right? How do diseases progress? What does this test mean? And when people are fearful, they tend to relinquish autonomy. They tend to relinquish personal and economic liberties. And when that comes across in medicine, you look to an organization that has the decision-making power to say, this is in, that is out. And what Higgs tracks going really back to the 1960s, but mostly into the 1970s, right? Mostly going with his medical device research, is when do we see devices, when do we see goods that have some element of risk, not a huge element of risk, but some element of risk goes through the processes. Sometimes they hurt more people more than they help. That reaches the public through various news medias. The public becomes fearful that the tests they're taking are not good and possibly harmful. The drugs they might be consuming could have longer term consequences. And when that fear is provoked, they turn to government and say, we want to make sure that we have safety, which is somewhat analogous to we want to make sure we can climb out of a crisis, right? The point he makes in Crisis and Leviathan. Well, there we have grounds for political exchange. Congress doesn't want people freaked out. Congress sees the opportunity. We can increase further power. Let's grant this thing called the Food and Drug Administration more authority to not just regulate what it had been regulating, but possibly more scrutiny, the ability to authorize more tests, to increase, if you will, the leverage it has to decide what gets on the market and what doesn't. But then in some cases, literally, if there is a product of concern, let the FDA run that. We saw that pretty recently with vaping regulations. People were generally concerned that middle schoolers, right, were picking up vaping pods and smoking and starting that and possibly getting a lifelong addiction to nicotine. The FDA had no authority over tobacco, it had no authority over nicotine, but there was a public outcry and a public fear. Congress, do something. Well, we have an organization that's not afraid to do something about that. It's called the FDA. The FDA gets authority over that. And then the FDA, as many people will know, right, starts seizing documents. It pushes Juul, which is one of the big pod producers, completely out of the US market. It starts deciding, okay, which of these flavors of pods, right, which people smoke, are marketed to kids. Turns out pancakes. A lot of people like pancakes. I guess kids like them a lot more, right? Because pancake flavored pods cannot be part of the market. So the FDA starts pushing that around. But what Higgs really contributes is taking his insights about how does government grow out of a period of crisis, leveraging both political incentive to expand power and fear, which motivates people to give up freedom. How does that apply to public health? Well, the FDA sets up that process, right? It leverages fear from the public. It gains political power from Congress. And that's been the story of the FDA, but arguably all of public health for, I mean, gosh, how far do you want to go back? 70 years at least.
Yeah, so that's important because it highlights the role of the public in making this all work, if you will, because you need the buy-in from the public in order for the policymakers in this framework in order for them to be able to both enact their policies, but also expand the scale and scope of their reach through time. And so we're moving towards the end here. I'm going to ask you a broad closing question, but then one specific aspect that I'd like you to touch upon with building on this point you mentioned and I just highlighted about the role of the public. And so the closing question for you is what you see as Bob's ongoing legacy as it pertains to the broader research program, your own, or just the broader research program of healthcare, the healthcare state, but also, if you don't mind, just commenting on the role of the public in pushback. In your chapter, you talk a little bit about reform, and you attribute a lot of that to public pressure. And so the crisis type logic, it's not deterministic, it's not unidirectional, meaning there is the possibility for pushback. And I was hoping you would speak to that a little bit, if you would.
Sure. I don't know how I could possibly compare my work to Robert Higgs's. I think that's a stretch, unfortunately. I'm happy to try to continue his research on FDA regulation, on FDA expansion, in my role in trying to emphasize market processes and markets broadly as a health economist. But he has said 95% of the framework I continue to use in my research. So I owe a huge intellectual debt to him. I'm not going to compare my work. But going off of, I guess, the second question, what are the prospects for reform? This is, especially in the chapter I write about, this is one of the aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic that we tend not to look at. COVID, I mean, at least for most market or political economists doing this kind of analysis, right? You look at the effects of lockdowns, you look at the effects of overarching bureaucracy and censorship and longer term problems of locking down society for a period of 2 years or possibly longer. What's missing from a lot of that is early in the pandemic, we had a crippling shortage of testing. This is in the United States specifically, right? You could not get a COVID test. Getting a COVID test was available on the black market for $800 in February of 2020. But why did we have such a shortage of testing? Well, COVID was novel. Coronaviruses were not novel, right? There's thousands of coronaviruses and we have tests for them. You can easily modify test to test for COVID. But we didn't have it. And the question was why? Well, who did all that research on medical devices, right? It was Robert Higgs. We have an idea of why that took so long to get those tests. And there was a pushback, right? We want tests. Get these tests out there. We're not worried about your regulatory processes. We want to know if we're sick. So at that point, the fear superseded the trust in government, which is why in March of 2020, this is one of the examples I write about loosely, you had the FDA issue an umbrella approach, which is the exact opposite of what the FDA always does. It was go out there, test for COVID, then a month later, send us your data and we'll decide if it meets our threshold. That's not what the FDA does. The FDA holds many products ransom and says, prove that it works, prove that it works, prove that it works. And we'll assess that over a period of, for medical devices, it can be 6 months up to 3 years. Here it was go test, then prove it. And most of the devices were, and most of the COVID tests were well done. When you go into August, you had something like 70 different kinds of COVID tests. Only 2 of them didn't pass the FDA's approval. One of those was from the CDC, which the FDA had previously approved. So I think that's grounds to question the FDA's process broadly. But there were other examples like that. The FDA did not want to let remdesivir onto the market. Remdesivir was the only treatment for COVID-19 in the early pandemic. It said it didn't pass enough of the tests, right? We saw it do fairly well in Ebola trials. We know it has some ability to thwart, if you will, these nasty infectious diseases. Doctors demanded it. We want to try remdesivir. And there were trials set up in Omaha. There were trials set up across the country. And eventually the FDA said, emergency use access, start using remdesivir. And then shortly before we had the COVID-19 vaccines, the FDA approved remdesivir. It didn't go through the approval process. Arguably the only drug that was never approved formally that goes through the process that the FDA later approved. And I think a lot of those instances, and there were a few others in the process and along the way, really started to make the public question, is the FDA really regulating these things effectively? But also, what's the potential risk of trusting the FDA during a crisis? And I think COVID was, for the most part, a real shock to a lot of people, right? We cannot trust the FDA to do these things. So fear for health, which is completely justified, right? A lot of medical decisions are scary, especially during a pandemic, superseded the willingness to give up freedom for some kind of security when it's shown that the security possibly wasn't there. And I think I wish I had as much optimism I did when I wrote the chapter as I did now, because now the FDA is starting to lurch back into areas where it was previously taking on new ventures. I do think that as long as we get that message across about the COVID-19 pandemic and remind people, hey, actually, deregulation and markets got you tests, got you treatment, to some degree got you the vaccines. Let's not forget that. But more broadly, just to try to wrap up here with the much broader message I made in my chapter, a lot of these ideas and these, if you will, important questions about political processes versus market processes and trusting organizations during crises and the role of consumer sovereignty when making complex medical decisions, a lot of that comes from the idea of Robert Higgs. And it's not discussed hardly at all in political economy circles. And I don't think that's right. So I think Higgs deserves a lot of the credit for this. And I was happy to write the chapter to try to argue that.
Yeah, I appreciate all that. And then, of course, one of the really important things, I think, is keeping those ideas not just alive, but advancing them, because it is so rare to have this alternative perspective that Bob offers us as part of the discussion. It's important to keep that as part of the discussion and to continue to build upon it and develop it as you're trying to do with your own research program. And so I greatly appreciate Bob's work, of course, but also yours in this area. For listeners who are interested in reading Ray's chapter or the other chapters in the volume, the title of the book is The Legacy of Robert Higgs, published by the Mercatus Center, and it is widely available, and you can find it online. Ray, thank you so much for writing the chapter and for taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Coyne. I am the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program at the Mercatus Center and a Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Today, I am happy to be joined by my colleague and co-author, Yuliya Yatsyshina. Yuliya is an Associate Program Director with the Academics and Student Programs with the Mercatus Center, and also a current PhD student in the Department of Economics at George Mason. Yuliya, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And today is exciting, of course, just to talk to you in general, but you are here to discuss our joint contribution to the Legacy of Robert Higgs volume. The title of our co-author chapter is The War Industry as Economic Cancer. And I want to start off talking a little bit about the origin of that title, because when people first hear it, it obviously has a lot of strong words in it, and it could come across as jarring. But there's a purpose why we selected that title. So tell us a little bit about the origins of it.
As I recall, when we started this project, we started with another working title. But as we progressed in our research and writing, a quote by the economist, educator, and peace activist Kenneth Boulding struck a chord. He said, "The war industry is a cancer within the body of American society. It has its own mode of growth. It represents a system which is virtually independent and indeed objectively inimical to the welfare of the American people, in spite of the fact that it still visualizes itself as their protector." And so what Professor Boulding identified early on, he spoke these words at a congressional testimony in 1969, is that the military system as it existed then and as it exists today has harmful economic and moral effects within the American society. In the latter parts of our paper, we define these as the immediate and long-term effects. But Boulding was concerned about the growing cooperation within a relatively small group of economic and public elites, which created unlimited opportunities for narrow opportunism that actually threatens the very things that it's supposed to protect. And as an educator, Boulding's choice of words, this metaphor, the cancer within the body of American society, this very intentional, jarring word captures the core of this paper that engages Robert Higgs scholarship.
Yeah, and so listeners who are unfamiliar, Kenneth Boulding is a famous economist in his own right. He was a president of the American Economic Association, among many other accolades, which is part of the reason that he was called to testify in front of this subcommittee. The topic of that testimony or of the subcommittee's work was the military budget and national economic priorities. And Boulding was also one of the founders of the field of defense and conflict economics, and so he was considered a expert on these issues. And so for him to sit in front of members of Congress and to talk about these potentially nefarious effects of military spending and the military sector, not just on economic activity, but on social, political life more broadly, was quite powerful. So let's transition then from, given that kind of foundation of Boulding's insight, let's then transition to the work of Robert Higgs. And so talk a little bit, if you will, about how Higgs's work on the political economy of the military sector fits in with Boulding's insight that you just summarized so nicely for us.
So, Professor Boulding's insights pointed to the overall harmful effects of the military system. And Robert Higgs' work provides insight into the mechanisms of their emergence, spread, and persistence. Robert Higgs believes that understanding of the specific mechanisms and the economic effects of the U.S. military system is important given its significant magnitude in terms of government spending and its activities. And let me just give you a few examples. The U.S. government spends $1 trillion annually on national security activities. The DoD is among the largest employers, and just the sheer multitude of companies that provide services to the DoD across the states in the United States, the real estate portfolio that it has, not only within the U.S. borders, but also overseas, and so on. So these numbers alone make it evident that military activity is completely entangled with private economic activity. And questions should be asked. To an ordinary citizen, however, the full extent of these ties may be difficult to grasp due to government secrecy and lack of transparency, for example. And what we mean by these ties are an extensive network of private actors, such as elected officials, civilians, and military bureaucrats, private actors, which include private firms, whether it's large or small firms, and people connected to the military sector, which all together make up this military machinery. Professor Higgs' academic work was dedicated to understanding the extent, the causes, means, and effects of this government growth, which resulted in a thorough analytical framework, firmly grounded in the historical evidence. He looked decades of historical evidence and provided this very thorough and insightful analytical framework. And in this paper, we engage Higgs' work and explore the U.S. military system as it presents today. We explain its overarching structure and the economic incentives within the system.
Well, thank you for that. So this is wonderful, because if we're going to understand the potentially nefarious aspects of the military sector, we have to start, which is what you and I try to do, of course, by first understanding the nature of the system itself. And it is a unique system. Exchange takes place, money is involved, profit and loss is involved, at least on the private side, which is why I think it's important you highlighted that array of actors. But of course, it's all embedded in politics, because the government is the ultimate provider of what people refer to as national defense, what I would call war making. They are the provider of it, but they're also the purchaser of these inputs into doing that. So it's intertwined with the private sector necessarily, in addition to all these different agencies and bureaus, as you noted, the elected officials, and so on. And of course, in principle, they're supposed to be representing the interests of the citizens, which we can talk about a little more. So given the nature of the system, I want to turn then to the kind of the next logical step. And I realize there's a lot of moving parts to this, and we try to go through many of them in the chapter. And it's not possible to discuss all of the nuances that we cover in the chapter. So we do hope, of course, that listeners will we'll pick up the volume and look for more detail in our chapter in the book. But summarize a bit for us what you and I call the machinery of the military system, how this system actually operates, and some of these moving parts that kind of animate it.
That's right. There are lots of moving parts, and let me try to outline some of the major elements of its nature and how the machinery operates. So, the way I see it, the nature is such that the personal connections are at the center of the private public military apparatus. And what I mean by that, and just like you said, Chris, is that the buyer and sellers of the military dealings are defined by a small group of political and economic elite who work together for their mutual benefit. And what made this mutually beneficial relationship possible, and what Robert Higgs pointed out, was an institutional change that occurred in the context of building military capability during World War II. At that time, in the early 40s, the Roosevelt administration changed government procurement laws from the sealed bid competitive method to cost plus fixed fee contract based on negotiations. And that, of course, elevated that political competition and political rent seeking. This change affected what Higgs calls an undefined but intimate relationship between the private and the public military elites. What followed since is the dramatic increase in defense contractors in all sizes, the big five, such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and others, and some smaller ones, medium size, of course. These large companies receive about 40%, 35 to 40% of the annual DoD budget, and over half of this budget annually goes to contractors of just all sizes. This process repeats and expands over time. So the defense procurement, though it has a multi-level, convoluted budgetary steps process involving Pentagon officials and congressional subcommittees and multiple approvals, in essence, is actually captured by a relatively small group of political and private elites who decide how the taxpayer money are spent, and they are also incentivized to keep this relationship going to continue to receive these benefits. Professor Higgs argues that this system is best characterized as one of military economic fascism. In the paper, we go into more details, but the essential feature is that the private ownership over the means of production exists. However, the administrative state dictates and shapes that production. This stands in contrast to the competitive market in which economic activity is guided by profit and loss, of course, and produces value out of output. But such knowledge creation just does not exist in the military system. Consider, for example, how numerous failures and criticism of the F-35 jet program do not in the least affect its procurement year after year. Okay, now that I've gone over the nature of the military system, let me go over how this machinery operates. So we can recognize that its actual nature and the way it is set up can create opportunities for narrow opportunism, which threatens people's safety, that this military system purports to protect. At the core of this is the incentive structure that allows the insiders, those who belong to the group of the private public military elite, to use their position to entrench and extend their interests. First, consider the private incentives the firms face. When their viability, remaining profitable over time, is dependent upon government contracts, this inevitably leads to rent seeking, which in economics refers to using resources to secure political privileges. This could take the form of lobbying or campaign contributions, various forms of entertainment, for example. And Robert Higgs notes that these are outright and de facto bribes, because they create an expectation of returning the favor in terms of a cushy government contract, regardless of the firm's past inadequate performance or malfeasance. And we provide several examples to illustrate this point. One being the Global Hawk drone program with its routine cost overruns and poor performance year after year. But when defense officials wanted to cut this program from the budget, the firm engaged in intense political lobbying and was successful at keeping it going. Political actors are not passive in this game, as they possess the decision-making power over defense-related resources. Since they have this discretion over which contractor to choose, allows them to extract resources from private parties seeking to secure government transfers. Furthermore, these public-private engagements create opportunities for the revolving door, which is the back and forth movements of the high-ranking government officials to become a defense firm executive or a board member of a defense contractor. These movements facilitate a reduced friction in the interactions between the private and public elites when the time of budget allocation decision comes. There's no really viable check on this activity except for what the Project on Government Oversight is doing. They are keeping a database to track these back and forth movements of senior Pentagon officials. Well, and to sum up, this rent-seeking and rent extraction, along with the free movements across private-public sectors, is a perverse interplay prevalent in the military system. It is how the system operates, perpetuates, and expands. And most importantly, it calls into question the common claim that the military is pursuing the national interest or providing defense for the people.
Well, thank you. So that was a wonderful overview of a very complex set of relationships and activities that defines how the machinery of the war industry operates. So just to kind of take stock where we are, since we're heading towards the end of our conversation, we talked a little bit about the nature of the system itself. You just nicely outlined for us the machinery. And let me just say a quick word before I ask you the final question about the effects of this then, because again, Boulding, that's the motivation, pointed out that there can be perverse effects of the operation of the war industry that's supposed to be beneficial to the citizenry. And so in the chapter, you and I break these, what we call the cancerous effects of the military system, into two broad categories: the immediate effects and the long and variable effects. And just to very briefly just mention them, and again, listeners who are interested are urged to read the chapter itself. These immediate effects include things like the distortion of the allocation of physical resources in the labor market as the state apparatus pulls these resources into military production. It entails things like the use of political competition that replaces market competition. This is what you put so nicely in your discussion of rent seeking and rent extraction. And of course, another immediate effect that you and I talk about are things like waste, fraud, and abuse. But as we also talk about then, there's these long and variable effects there. Some of them are unseen. They're going to be hard to trace back, and oftentimes to military related activity in the present period. But some of these effects that you and I talk about are things like distortions to the capital structure itself. Any kind of advanced material production entails a very roundabout, long-term process of production. And as the government pulls resources out of the private sector, it's going to distort not just the allocation of those resources in the here and now, but also in the long-term capital structure. It includes things like undermining the dynamism of markets. Again, as you put it so nicely in your comments, all of these political relationships turn on politics. It turns on, there's profit and loss involved, but the customer is no longer the private consumer, but is the political gatekeeper who has access to the political purse. One of the quotes that you and I have in the book that I just want to read quickly is by John Kenneth Galbraith. And this might surprise some listeners, of course, because Galbraith was ideologically on the left. But in his book, this is from his book, The New Industrial State, which was published in the late 1970s. Galbraith wrote, quote, "The Department of Defense supports the most highly developed planning in the planning system," end quote. So what Galbraith was pointing out was that the military sector is a form of planning. It's not comprehensive planning of all economic activity, but it's what Don Lavoie called non-comprehensive planning. And that has real effects on economic activity, both in the immediate term and through time. And so that's what Boulding was talking about. That's what Higgs is talking about, which then leads to my final question for you, which as we close, I want you to talk a little bit about what you see as the legacy of Robert Higgs. The title of the volume itself is The Legacy of Robert Higgs. So as it pertains to the things you and I have been talking about here, the war industry, what do you see as the legacy of Higgs, but also the ongoing relevance of his research program?
I think the most important takeaway is that the military industrial system as it exists today is unlikely to transform itself unless the people demand some sort of change. And for the people to demand change of this system, people need to be aware of the extent of its cancerous effects. And Higgs scholarships continues to be relevant with respect to making people aware of the serious problem that exists in our society, to kind of jolt those who would, pick up his book or listen to this podcast or read our paper. And yes, that means, some action will mean overcoming some high transaction costs as it relates to influencing political outcomes. But with enough people demanding change, that change can happen. And I think that's what Robert Higgs would like to see.
Yeah. So, the elsewhere, not in his discussion of this material, but elsewhere in his writings, Higgs makes this distinction I always like about, and I use it myself both in my own writing and teaching, which is there's diagnostics and there's therapeutics. The diagnostics is the use of the tools of economics and political economy to understand and analyze some phenomena in the world that we as social scientists want to understand. That has a lot of value in itself. And so a bulk of our chapter is that diagnostic exercise about what the military industry looks like. And then, of course, that's separate, but related to this issue of therapeutics, which is then, well, let's say you want to change something. What do you do about it? They're related, of course, because in order to do something about it, you have to understand the roots of it in the first place. And so you're certainly right. I think that in terms of the therapeutics, to the extent anything's going to get done, there has to be some call to arms, perhaps for lack of a better term, from the citizenry, because the incentives that are endogenous to the war industry itself is constantly going to push to expand and grow. There are no endogenous incentives to shrink. And so that's where the citizenry comes into play. That's where at least an awareness of how the system operates comes into play. And our joint hope is that people pay attention to this, both with what we've wrote, but also what Bob Higgs has written on this topic as well. Yuliya, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today, and of course, for also taking the time to co-author this chapter with me. Again, this is part of a volume called The Legacy of Robert Higgs, and I'd like to urge listeners who are interested to pick up the book, which was recently published by the Mercatus Center, and to check out our chapter, but the other chapters as well. Yuliya, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.